Hey everybody, Brendan here. Welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be covering game number 3 of my Mississauga Summer Under 2100 tournament. I am currently on 1 out of 2. I played against Eric in the first round. I ended up losing that with the white pieces. Then I won with the black pieces in a Sicilian, which I wasn't really proud of anyways. But now we have a game that I kind of was proud of. I was relatively happy how it went. It didn't feel like I gave any chances. So I'm playing with the white pieces here against Marco, and I'm starting with d4. So after d4, we see b6, and now you can arguably say you transpose into e4, but that's not exactly what happened here because, well, it's a d4 and d4 opening. Like, it doesn't matter because if you play e4, they play b6, and you play d4, you can say you transpose into d4. But, alright, so we get the full center because they played b6, now bishop b7, and I play one of the sharpest lines, bishop d3. So why is it one of the sharpest lines? The first thing we should look at is f5. This is kind of why it's one of the sharper ones. But this is not really working. Like, if you just go down the forced continuation, a lot of people play this online, but it kind of loses by force. E takes f5, bishop takes g2. Looks like, well, congratulations, they're winning the rook, but their king just kind of gets mated here. Bishop g7. We take on h7, king f8. We don't take on g8. We actually just develop with knight f3, and this is totally winning. If they take on f3, this is a mistake because we win the rook in the corner, so they shouldn't do that. And if they take our rook, then we actually have knight e5. And this doesn't look like it's immediately winning, but it is, because what do they do here? So, for example, bishop takes e5 looks natural, but after we take back, now we're actually threatening some sort of taking on g8. There's also bishop h6 threats in the air, and this is completely losing. And if they instead, in this position here, play a move like queen e8 to defend against queen f7 checkmate, problem is this doesn't really work either, because now we can take and promote. Rook takes g8, queen f5 check, bishop f6, and now bishop to h6. This just wins the house, and we are totally winning. So yeah, the line pretty much just loses by force, so it's not really something to be worried about. You do need to know the continuations and know that knight f3 is the move, and know that even though we hang the rook on h1, it doesn't really matter. But alright, e6 was played instead because my opponent didn't want to lose right out of the opening, which is fair. I played knight f3, we see c5, c3, knight f6, and now queen e2. I didn't see a point to play knight c3 or anything, or knight d2, my apologies, because if knight d2, that might justify some sort of taking on d4 here, because, well, now my knight can't go to c3, which is where it would want to be. So queen e2 is just a little bit more flexible, and here my opponent makes a strategic mistake by taking on d4. Why is this a strategic mistake? So you would think they're trading the c5 pawn for a d4 pawn, which is a central pawn. You think this is a good trade. The problem is we can recapture with our pawn. And whenever you can capture a pawn and then they can capture back specifically with their pawn, you should just ask how the resulting position looks. And here what we can say is actually these two pawns were traded for each other, not the d4 pawn. And the c5 pawn was much more valuable than the c3 pawn, because the c3 pawn was preventing my knight from developing, and, well, their c5 pawn was attacking the center and doing a good job there. So, yeah, c takes d4 was not really the best approach here. My opponent ended up playing d5, which just makes things even harder, and arguably this is losing at this point. e5, knight e4, and of course I don't capture on e4. This is one thing to note, that this might look tempting, but this actually just loses a pawn here after queen takes d4. So this would be very, very bad. Instead, I just castle, because now I can just go like knight d2 and then force them to exchange with me and develop more pieces. Bishop e7, knight b d2, they took, I took, and just looking at how the pieces look in this position, we can kind of tell that white should be better. This is actually just winning, but we can tell that white should be better just because, again, the bishop on b7 is looking at nothing. Their bishop on e7 is kind of okay, but it's not really able to do too much. The knight on c6 doesn't necessarily have a clear path. And, well, they have potential problems on the c-file and on h7, like the king side. So this is kind of just dead lost. My opponent ends up castling here. Rook a c1. I'm going to start taking over the c-file because they're way too slow to get to it. a5 was played in order to play bishop a6 and trade off my d3 bishop, which is a very good piece. Like, if you think strategically, you would love to take these two pieces off the board as black. The problem is I get a lot of activity in the meantime. So rook c2, bishop a6, rook fc1, takes, queen takes. And with the resulting pieces, it's not really much better because their knight isn't so great. Their bishop it's okay, but it's not amazing. Whereas my knight's relatively good. The bishop has a bit more activity, and I have the full c-file, and my queen is developed. So that's kind of a plus for me. So knight a6 was played, and I played a3 to prevent any knight b4 stuff. That was kind of a non-starter. I didn't want to allow any of that. And one thing that is good for them is now I can't really go rook c7 anymore because the knight on a6 is playing a good defensive role. And then my opponent plays f6, trying to open up the f-file here. So yeah, a mistake would be taking. I think that offers more dynamic chances. Maybe they play g takes on f6, king h8, and like rook g8, like this here, and then maybe they transfer the rook over to g8 or get some crazy central activity, and that's not something I'd want. So here I just play queen to b5, and the idea is rook c6, queen takes b6, or even just rook c6 taking the e6 pawn. Neither of them I think my opponent would want to allow anyways. So they took on e5, I took back, and then they played bishop d6. So even though I have the c-file, I think it's a little unnecessary now. At least I did in the game. So I played rook e1, and I just transferred over. I'm going to target the e6 pawn now that there's an actual weakness to target. So I'll play a move like bishop c3, rook e2. Eventually I'll move my knight, and e6 will fall. My opponent played queen h4, which I thought was annoying because if I play the natural move bishop e3, then there's problems with taking on e5 now. Like I don't want to allow that. There's no reason to. But I played bishop c3, and now they played bishop c7, and I decided to kick the queen out with g3, which I think is totally fine. Queen d8, and now rook ce2, and here my transfer has been complete. I'm targeting the e6 pawn a little bit more. I'm ready to eventually play a move like knight d3, and e6 should just fall. Alright, so now queen d6 was played, going for some activity here. I'm not exactly sure what the move specifically does. I think it just connects the rooks, which isn't a bad idea. And then I played h4, trying to get more space on the king side. So one idea that you'll commonly see in French positions is h4, h5, h6. And that's just something that I'm just keeping in the cards. It's just a nice move to get in because it just gets more activity. And it's less trying to do something specific and trying to target them and trying to win on the spot. It's more like I have an advantage. It's hard for my opponent to improve. So if I play a move like h4, my advantage doesn't really go away. And I still stand behind the move. Now we see rook f6. I play bishop d2. So I need to reroute the bishop. The bishop on c3 is not really doing anything. So the idea here is it can reroute to much more useful squares on the king side. And now bishop d8 was played, and I have somewhat of a puzzle for you. There is no winning tactic here, but there is an idea that we can play in order to get more activity. It's not the only way to improve the position at all, but it was something that I was kind of happy with because it is something that strategically makes a lot of sense here. So I will give a little bit of time to pause and just think of how to improve the position further. So here I ended up playing queen e8 check. The only thing that we haven't really done is improve our queen to where it wants to be. I'm not really going for the c file anymore. It doesn't make sense to. I mean, it's probably still a good plan, but my idea was to target e6, which is a backward pawn, and the king, because there's less king cover because, well, the pawn f takes e6, the move f takes e6 was played. So I'm always threatening ideas like h5, and where would I want my queen? Like, my rook is perfectly placed, my other rook is as well, the bishop can go to g5 at some point, but it's relatively well placed right now, the knight is well placed as well. The only piece that I thought needed significant improvement was actually my queen on b5. So queen e8 check, the idea here was after rook f8, queen h5, and now all of a sudden it just shifted over to the king side, where now I can play moves like queen e6 to target e6 more. I can play h5, h6, and this makes a lot more sense with my queen opposed to the king. My opponent played knight c7. I played queen g4. Again, potential ideas of h5, h6, for example. My opponent played bishop f6. I played knight f3. I wasn't really too ecstatic about the idea of them trading on e5. I wanted to keep some pieces on the board and try to provoke some weaknesses here. And this also has an idea of bishop f4, which just wins e6 immediately. And there's not really anything they can do about it. Like, for example, rook d8, bishop f4, queen d7 takes, and now e6 falls, and the game is definitely over at this point. So knight f3 has the idea of bishop f4. So that's why they played queen d8. But the problem is, after queen to d8, I can still play bishop f4. And I did. So there is a little thing that has to be noted here. Now they have the move knight b5 to attack d4, and I don't want to take on e6. Instead, I think a better move is bishop g5 immediately. And now d4 is going to be covered, and I'm going to win e6 anyways without losing d4. So it's just a way to avoid any complications, which I think is really important in these types of positions, where if you're just clearly winning, don't allow complications. It just makes things messier for no reason. Bishop g5, and if they took, I would just take with the knight here, and e6 is just going to fall. And this is an ideal situation for us here. King h8 was played instead, so I took on e6. Knight to d6 was played, and now I took on f6 here. And my opponent ended up taking with the pawn. I think they were worried of something like this. If we traded everything here, there could be some rook e6 problems, where this just does not look pleasant. After knight g5, we're already threatening rook takes d6, and we're also threatening, like, because of knight f7, and then if they move their knight, we're threatening knight f7 anyways. And the only way to defend is like rook a7, but this also doesn't work, I believe, because of rook takes d6 and queen c8 check, which doesn't really need to be calculated, because this position already looks really dire. They're down a pawn, and it's a pretty serious one. So g takes f6. I played rook e7, trying to take advantage of the 7th rank now, and just go for more activity. Rook f7 was played, and I was really trying to avoid any trades, but I didn't really see a choice here. I thought we kind of have to, so I ended up trading, and then I played queen e6, which I thought was a good move. And the idea here is that, well, they have to play king g7, and now I can play rook c1. And the idea of rook c1 is I'm just going to target them on both sides of the board, and they can't really do anything about it. Like queen d6, for example, we can look at either taking it, or we can just look at queen g4 check or queen f5. And no matter what we do here, with rook c1, the big idea is that instead of queen d6 here, the idea is it's going to be hard for them to take over any of the open files without making some concessions. With like queen d6, at the very least, there's also moves like rook to d6 as well. I think taking is also perfectly fine. It does make some sense. I think it's less likely I would have played it though, but it looks like we're winning a pawn right off the bat if we just play like this. So actually there's knight c4, so that might be a little bit less clear. Yeah, this is something to watch out for. So that's why calculation is necessary. But my opponent ended up playing queen d6 anyways here. Queen g4 check, which again was my idea from the first place because trading queens doesn't make sense. King f8 was played, and now knight d2. So why knight d2? First off, it's kind of like the same puzzle as before, where we had our queen on b5, we shuffled it over to g4. Now what's our worst piece? And I kind of ruined the surprise by showing the move, but our next worst piece is the knight. The knight looks like it's kind of doing something, but it's also not, because this f6 pawn is surprisingly useful. And where would it belong instead? Well, first off, knight d2 is the idea behind it, or like that will kind of spoil the idea maybe a little bit, but the knight belongs on e3. So I'm just making the simple maneuver. It's kind of hard to make any reasonable activity work for black here. In time, I'm just going to play knight d2, knight f1, knight e3, and all of a sudden f5 is a problem. If I play knight f5, then there's mate potential on the king side, and also I'm attacking d5 forever. So that's what we see: knight d2, queen d8, knight f1, knight d6, and knight e3. And we just saw a huge shift happen where all of a sudden I have a lot of activity and my opponent does not. Well, they kind of get some activity after rook c8, but it's just not really in time. So, for example, if they were to, after takes, which is what I played, if they were to take with the queen here, I don't have to trade. I could go queen f3, which I think is a pretty reasonable move. But even if I traded, this doesn't look so bad. I'm attacking f6, I'm attacking b6. There is more promising. It doesn't make sense at all to trade the queens here. I think queen f4 is also maybe even a cleaner move, just because it attacks the knight, attacks the pawn, and d5 is hanging. Maybe queen c1 check, king g2. But now they have to move the knight, and if they do, then there's checks on the back rank. There's potential knight f5s in the air. Like this looks pretty hopeless actually. Knight takes piece d5 should just win the game though, because after this trade, everything is kind of hanging. So, yeah, just like that's kind of just a general impression. But they didn't even take like that anyways. They ended up taking with the knight to cover d5, but now queen e6 comes, and my opponent ends up just resigning because there's not really a way to hold everything together. d5 is going to fall, and once d5 falls, it's important to note that black's not even getting a pawn for it here. The only move that would actually defend everything properly is knight to e7, but queen takes f6 can be played then, and that's definitely losing. So I was relatively happy with the game. I would say the big two moments that I'm very, very happy with and impressed at looking back at it is the idea of queen e8 to h5 to shuffle my queen over to the king side, go for the king side attack, at least put some pressure over there and put pressure on e6. And lastly, the other part that I was relatively happy with was this maneuver with knight d2, f1, and e3, where all of a sudden all my pieces just kind of got where they wanted to be, and the game didn't last much longer after that. So that is going to cover it for this round. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in round number 4. Have a good one. Bye-bye.